We now welcome on a very special guest, Nicole Auerbach of The Athletic, senior college football writer, host on SiriusXM, frequent appearance, frequent guest on the Big Ten Network, University of Michigan graduate. Nicole, thanks for coming on. Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's start with the whole Michigan thing. You're obviously a Michigan graduate, like I said, Michigan Daily alum. What's one of your favorite memories from covering Michigan, working for the Daily, and being a student and being a part of this whole thing?
Yeah, well, it's interesting from an athletic standpoint. I was at Michigan during the worst four-year stretch of football
Yep.
history. Started with App State as a freshman, my first game as a Michigan student.
Mm-hmm.
And then it ended with the end of the Rich Rod era. So not a ton of football highlights, but it was a very interesting time to be around the program. And certainly I joined the Daily. My first meeting was the day after App State. So it was really interesting to see them. It had this whole planned out thing. I mean, it was Chad Henne and Jake Long and Mike Hart, and they decided to come back and go for a national championship, and they just like had to scrap this whole section and start over and write like, how the heck did this happen? And so it was a very interesting, first day at the student newspaper, and to just see kind of how it works and how nimble you have to be. I covered a basketball team that was preseason top 15 and then didn't make the NIT.
Mm-hmm.
Covered a hockey team that was a number one seed in the NCAA tournament, lost in the first round. So again, like it was very interesting. There were historic moments to cover, but not a ton of big wins. And so it was interesting. And then there were having covered Michigan after because I've covered college sports this whole time. I've got to cover Michigan in the title game for March Madness and big Ohio State games and things of that nature. So that's been cool because I think there's an understanding and appreciation of that type of context when it is a historic program that is so used to winning, especially when you're talking about football. And then to go through a stretch like the one I lived through as a student, and then to come out of it and put everything else in context when you're covering it. So, it was very interesting. But it was fun to be at the Daily and to just kind of mess around and learn and see, how to do it, how to learn from, people who were older. And, I had different internships at newspapers in the summers, and you come back and kind of take some of that stuff into the student paper. But, I think the best memories you have are like the people you work with on the beats, because you're driving through the night to get places and staying in really crappy hotels. So, I think my favorite beat partner was Joe Stapleton. We covered basketball together and then football. And no one was more passionate or knew more about Michigan basketball than him. And so, we did a lot of the midweek road trips, to Madison on a Wednesday and all of these things during basketball season. And, those were some great memories. So again, the wins weren't exactly there, but it was a really great learning experience. And again, I think it helps in taking that context into covering them professionally afterwards.
Mm-hmm. It was an interesting time because it was one of the more darkest times in Michigan football, certainly. But there's books about it, and so it was noteworthy in a certain way. But let's move into your thoughts on the possibilities of a football season, what it might look like, and get into some of those details. First, you broke the news that it was going to be a Big Ten conference-only schedule for the Big Ten Conference. There hasn't been any, dates announced for any of the games and things like that. Seems like it's going to be 10 games, but when do you expect an announcement on that? And what are you hearing in terms of when it may start? Because you look at other teams around college football, they're moving up to week 0. When you look at Oklahoma, I think Kansas as well moved a game to week 0, August 29th. But it seems like right now, and the Wolverines' John Borton kind of reported this the other day, and people have been talking about that the Big Ten might move back. So what are your thoughts on that, and what are you hearing in those regards?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get, clarity about what that schedule is going to look like and the potential start date until later in the week, the back half of the week, which is, the ACC will probably get some clarity on Wednesday. And then, the Pac-12 on Friday. So, the Big Ten could be in the middle there or also on Friday. And I do think that most of these leagues are looking at potentially pushing back the start of the season. And so what the Big 12 is doing is interesting, with two teams committed to playing week 0. Another team, Iowa State, just announced they're going to play Ball State. It's supposed to play Michigan as well. And that is going to round out their non-conference. So, they seem pretty committed to playing those non-conference games in a way that, some of the other leagues aren't. One of the front runner possibilities in the ACC is a 10 conference games plus 1 non-conference. So that's very different than what the Big 12 is doing and trying to move up. So yeah, I do think that most people will try to move back. But the thinking is actually pretty similar with the Big 12. It's this idea of, okay, if we have X amount of games and Y amount of weeks, you're trying to stretch the season as much as possible so that if there's cancellations or no contests or forfeits, whatever they're going to be determined as, you can make those games up. But I do think that, the thinking with the Big Ten going conference only, it's you have that flexibility, right? You're going to play 10 games over 14 weeks. So if you do start a couple weeks later, 1, 2, 3 weeks later, you have that built-in flexibility already, and you can always push your championship game back a little bit to have a couple of weeks where everybody's off if you need to make up games that are important to the race. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the schedule looks like. Like I'm curious, we haven't had the ability to start from scratch and make a schedule, in forever. So, do you play the divisional games first? Probably, right? So you can have divisional races. I would play Michigan, Ohio State week 1. Like I would just, because if the whole thinking is you're not sure you're going to get through the full season, and that, you're not sure you're going to get through every game and you're going to need to make them up, try to play the big games first. And then if they need to be made up, you have all of those open dates the way the schedule is going to look, right? So I would love to see that type of creativity and an approach to it. So I'm actually very curious, even if we don't end up getting a fall season, I do want to see what they were thinking, because I do hope that some of these philosophies that come with scheduling, when you had a blank slate, can be used in the future, and that we don't always need to schedule 15 years out for non-conference games and things of that nature that we've kind of always done. I would like to see people kind of take some of this like fresh approach to what they're doing for 2020 and maybe carry it into the future in a normal year.
That's interesting. I heard you say that the other day with Andy Staples on his podcast. The Michigan-Ohio State game, if it was week 1, from a purely football standpoint, well, we need to play that game in terms of if there is a season and that game doesn't happen. I think college football will miss that game. So I think it is a good point to play those divisional games early, the ones that really matter, the teams you play every year, the Michigan State, Michigan Penn State, Michigan Ohio State. From purely football standpoint, though, what does that look like? Do you think it's a good thing for Michigan if they were to play Ohio State and maybe not play them at the end of the year?
Yeah, I mean, right. Like, I think everyone this year is going to probably not feel ready to start the season, right? Like, you didn't have your full spring practices. You had 3 months where your players were at home trying to stay in shape, right? Like, there have been all of these disruptions and craziness, and that's why you've had like this extended ramp up period before the official preseason camp starts. But in the Big Ten, you've also had Michigan State and Rutgers have to quarantine their whole programs, right? So that's going to affect their ability to get ready and feel confident starting the season as well from a development standpoint. So I don't think anyone's going to feel great, about where they are with the playbook, where they are from a, conditioning standpoint when they start the season. But if the alternative is not playing, I think people will still be excited about it, and I think people would understand that maybe the quality isn't going to be what it normally is. Or would normally be, by the end of a season when you are playing your rivalry games and you guys are both hopefully peaking and healthy. So again, I think everyone's expectations would be recalibrated for this year. No matter how many games you get, if you can get a fall season, and, no matter how many games you get, who can play, if there are star players that do decide to opt out, essentially, right? We're seeing it with the NFL with that language, and I guess I'm going to steal it for college sports. Forego your senior season or whatever and go to the draft. You could still see that for an abbreviated fall season too, not just if they go to spring. So I think, considering all of that, like if you get games, I think people will still be appreciative of that. People will still be excited about that. So it's all about recalibrating expectations. It may not be the best football. It may not be all the star players. It may not be 12 games. But if we're able to get something in the fall, I think people will be really, really excited that we have it and that you're not going an entire fall without college football.
It's a great point because we already know it's going to be weird without fans or limited and, not exactly sure the details, but it is going to be weird either way. It would be crazy to have Michigan Ohio State to start. So I wanted to talk about the August 4th upcoming NCAA Board of Governors meeting. You've written about that in recent days and how important that's going to be. What do you expect to come out of that and any announcement we may hear after that meeting occurs?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a big day for college sports. This was something that they could have potentially done and voted on last week, but they decided to push it. And, if you read through the lines and the way that the NCAA put out their statement, they're basically putting it up on a tee, right, to make this call about fall championships. And really what's at stake here is the NCAA controls, the soccer championships, fall volleyball, cross country, FCS football, but they don't control FBS. So that's Power 5 and Group of 5. But they can make a determination that all fall championships that they control are canceled. So at that point, can you play just FBS football? Can that be the only sport that is happening and pushing towards a postseason? I mean, that's a big question. I think that there would be a ton of pressure. There would be a lot of optics concerns. There would be issues about the collegiate model has been challenged in court, right? And you'd be saying okay, they're not actually like the rest of the students on campus, and they're also not even like the rest of the student athletes on campus, right? So there would be some serious problems with that, which is part of the reason that the FBS commissioners have been pushing them not to make that vote on Friday because they're not ready to give up the chance to play in the fall. They want to postpone. They want to look at models. My dog is squeaking in the background, so he has a lot of thoughts about this as well. His name is Red Auerbach. He's very athletic and the former coach of the Celtics. So he has a lot of sports opinions. But yeah, so I think that is a very important decision, even if they don't directly control FBS postseason, because as we know, that's the bowl system and that's the college football playoff. Get up here. Come here. No, yeah. Now he's being shy.
Okay, there we go. And that's interesting because I think there is a decent chance that, let's say, the FCS or other sports say we can't do it, and the NCAA says no to fall championships. But the Power 5, with how much money is involved, I think they could possibly do it. I know it would be bad optics, like you said, a ton of pressure, because if anything goes wrong, it's like, hey, you were going rogue here when everybody else was canceling and doing the smart thing, quote unquote. But there's so much money there. And I wanted to ask you about, with those implications, the financial implications. You hear about largely the players want to play, the coaches want to play. There's livelihoods at stake at the same time, which you kind of have to factor in. But what's the length they're going to go to get this done, even if it is just Power 5 playing?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? And we've seen different dollar figures. You saw Barry Alvarez in Wisconsin put out, a number, and then you saw Jamie Pollard at Iowa State put out a very different number. Yeah. So I do think it is something that will be different depending on each school, and also would be different depending on, if you are able to play in the spring, what can you recoup, right? What if this spring you're able to play and you're able to have more people in the stands, so you're able to bring in some ticket revenue. So there are a lot of different contingency plans related to different financial models, depending on how many games you get in, when they're played, and what it does for your media rights agreements. So it's really hard to predict right now, but I think you've already seen, even at Power 5 level, athletic departments have furloughs. You've seen layoffs. You've seen college football coaches take furloughs and pay cuts. So all of that stuff would absolutely continue. The last thing anyone wants to do is cut sports, but that would probably happen in a lot of places, and scholarships and opportunities for athletes. So there would be huge repercussions, which is why we're even having this conversation, right? That why would we even talk about, could you play just the Power 5? Can you play just FBS if everything else is shut down? It's because of these reasons. It's because of how many livelihoods are at stake. So again, we'll have, I think in the next couple of weeks, we'll have clarity about, can you do fall at all? even if you are the only one, and we'll know from there. But if those answers are no, you will probably start to see the financial impact immediately, because again, everyone has been modeling out the best and worst case scenarios and everything in between, so they know what they would need to cut.
My biggest question as we sit here at the end of July is, you mentioned Michigan State, Rutgers. Okay, 14-day shutdown. They had a little bit of an outbreak. Turns out Michigan State's continuing, more positive tests. My question on that, I don't expect you to necessarily know the exact answer to, or anybody to, but is this the way they would react in training camp? Is this the way they would react in the regular season, or are they being overly cautious because we're only in phase 3 here, just at the beginning, with voluntary or mandatory now walkthroughs and meetings and workouts? Is this the same reaction they would have? And I just wanted to get your thoughts on if that's something you're pondering as well.
Yeah, that is something, you're trying to figure out, is this what it would look like? And I think you've got to think yes, because, when you look at the guidelines that the NCAA put out, and that the that the Power Five is expected to adopt and make, stricter rules, not just guidelines. I do think you are seeing, you're seeing how the contact tracing can lead to more and more players being required to go into a 14-day quarantine if they've been in close contact for extended periods of time with someone who tests positive. And so it's easy to imagine the entire offensive line, the entire defensive line. This is a sport of close contact, right? So it's easy to see that, you could have a couple of positives impact an entire roster, or enough of a roster that you would require shutdown. We don't know what the percentages or numbers would need to be to get, cancel a game or forfeit a game that week, right? But I do think that the idea that an entire team would go into quarantine because of a certain threshold that is hit, that is absolutely something that could happen. And so I think it's a good measure, even if it is a little bit overly cautious. With Rutgers, we don't quite know as much. I feel like we've gotten more numbers, and we've gotten numbers about staffers at Michigan State, right? So it's a little bit easier to kind of plot it out. But I think that it is just it's a helpful experience to happen, just because we see that on top of what's happening with the Marlins, of like, okay, we've thought about this stuff hypothetically for months, and this is what it would actually look like. This is a 2-week shutdown. When you're talking about, okay, we're scheduling with extra bye weeks so that you can make up games, it's because this sort of thing would happen where an entire team would just be out of commission for 2 weeks and couldn't play. So I think it almost doesn't matter if it's just overly cautious or not, because it actually totally shows us what the season could look like. And it's very real for those teams about, as we were talking about earlier, like the conditioning and the game prep stuff. They're missing out and falling behind by not having those 2 weeks. And the exact same thing would happen in season if you miss 2 weeks of the season.
Right. I think that's interesting. To wrap up quickly, let's say the MLB, they're probably the closest professional model right now to what the NCAA and college football would be, because they're traveling. They're not in a bubble like the NBA. Let's say the MLB shuts down in 2 weeks. We're seeing some problems with the Marlins and things like that. They shut down in 2 weeks. Is there any chance college football gets played, in your opinion?
Well, they have been saying that they are following pro sports. They're trying to see what works and what doesn't. And in baseball, as you mentioned, not in a bubble and traveling. NFL, same thing. Their training camps, you've got players starting to report. So those are both things that everyone is tracking. And I absolutely think if a professional sports league is not able to play, obviously there's different protocols and different rules and stuff, but it makes it a lot harder to justify trying to start a college football season. And I think, even to the point where, like, you talk about state leaders and decisions being made for college sports, right? You're talking about, okay, like how many people could come to a game, if there could be crowds. You also got to think about travel restrictions. There are a lot of states that have implemented rules about, not, if you go to a certain state and you come back, it's a mandatory 14-day quarantine. Baseball teams got that exemption because that's kind of why Toronto was stranded and wasn't able to play in Canada. They wouldn't grant them that exemption. So you have a sport that was made even easier to travel, was, like they were given this exemption, and the logistics were in such a way that it was easier and more likely to play, and they still had this outbreak. They still were in a position where a group chat decided to play. and that there wasn't a plan in place or requirements in place to shut things down. So you learn from all of that. But I think in general, if these leagues, which again have pro athletes who are paid, who have unions negotiating things, if they're not able to go, it makes it very hard to do that with amateur athletes who don't have that type of protection.
Well, we're all rooting for the pro sports teams to do it safely, college football to get off safely. Before I let you go, last thing is just a record prediction, 10-game Michigan football record prediction, and who wins the starting quarterback job.
Without even a schedule? Can you just come back to me when we get a schedule?
Yeah, that's true.
All right. I'm gonna punt on that decision because I have. Okay. I promise I will come back on and we can go through that. But I need to know again, like, are you gonna play all the division games? Are you potentially gonna play anybody twice? What are your crossover games? I need to see that before I make a number prediction.
Okay, that's fair. I'll hold you to that, and we'll go through the schedule, and hopefully it gets released, and we're able to get closer and closer to college football. But Nicole Auerbach from The Athletic, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, anytime.